So with me today, we have a good friend of mine, Nick, from Tech Heuer, and with him, he has brought over 50 different Heuer Carreras. So this is the reference points for the Heuer Carrera. And we have really the entire range of what I would classify as a vintage Carrera. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, yeah. We're going to cover the history from 63 until 1984 when the Carrera had its kind of first demise, let's say, before it was reintroduced in 1996. But yeah, here we're talking about this first history under Jack in the 60s and 70s.
So if you could, just explain the different groups of Carreras we have here.
Yeah, so what I've tried to do to break these down is that we have a collection of pre-Carreras, the 2444, 3336, and 2447, including this super funky Abercrombie signed one. Then we have the first generation of manual wind watches with the single stick baton markers, starting with the earliest Swiss-only executions, and then running through to a number of series, including the tachymeter decimal pulsation scales here. Then we have the calendar watches, so the two Dato 12s in black and silver, the Dato 9s again in black and silver, and then the triple calendar chronograph. And then we have the second generation of manual wind watches, the Panda, the reverse Panda, the two funky editions here, the Belgian Air Force 7753 and your delightful Skipperera 7754. And then to complete the first series of manual wind watches, we have the gold pieces, the gold plated and solid gold. So that's the top row. And then on the bottom row, we have the automatic chronographs and some extended pieces from that family. So we start off with the reference 1153, the chronomatic, and then the variations there. The caliber 15 version, the later design styles for the caliber 12. Then the gold pieces, reference 1158, we have the Chronomatic S, we have the Standard S, we have the Champagne, we have two CHNs, one with the silver date window and one with the black date window. And then we have three manual wind pieces. We have the gold plated with pulsation scale, we have the two register calendar version, and the three register in steel with blue dial. And then we move on to the barrel cases. So we have the pieces powered by the caliber 12 in the fume and the blue, the black coated, the gold, and the caliber 15s. Two pieces from the Quartz era, and then finishing off with the three Le Mans 5100 power Carreras.
So let's talk a little bit about the name Carrera, because
Sure.
I think that's worth exploring a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's fascinating when you look back at the 1950s, motorsport in particular, and this legendary race, the Carrera Panamericana, that ran from 1950 to 1954, originally activity for the Mexican government to drum up tourism, but it proved to be extremely deadly, extremely dangerous, a huge test of man and machine. And Jack heard the story in 1962 from the parents of the Rodriguez brothers, Pedro and Ricardo, who were racing at Sebring. Jack was there to try and sell some watches and drum up some business with the SCCA. And he fell in love with the name. And that's how it arrived on his second product, introduced under his reign, the Ottavia in 1962, and then the Carrera in 1963 as the more elegant chronograph.
Yeah, and it's amazing to think about, and I've written about this many years ago, but that period, 1962-63, we have the brother watch, which I would say is the Rolex Daytona, which
Sure.
shared a movement maker, dial maker,
Yep.
et cetera.
Bracelet, everything. Yep.
Pretty much everything. And then, of course, you have an icon from another realm in the Porsche 911,
Absolutely.
or really Porsches in general, using the exact same name Carrera for a car.
Yeah, and just to explain the Porsche connection, so in 1950 and 1951 at the Carrera Panamericana, it was predominantly locals, North Americans coming down in, big Cadillacs and Hudsons and these kind of things. And then in 52, 53, 54, some of the international brands heard about this incredible race through Mexico over a number of days, thousands of kilometers. And like Le Mans, they saw it as a chance to really test the machinery. So Porsche shipped a load of 550 Spiders down, and Hans Hermann at the wheel got the class victory in 53, and in 54 they got the class victory as well. And for the race, they needed a more powerful engine. And these high performance variants of the engines became known as Carrera because they were developed for the race.
Yep. And so I was always curious, is there any kind of history with the idea of Heuer and Porsche, who to this day have a close relationship? Is there any rivalry about the use of the name Carrera? Because we see them on watches, obviously, on dials, and we certainly see them on the back of 911s to this day.
Yeah. I mean, the amazing thing was when the Carrera was first introduced in 1996, the tag Heuer Carrera at the time, the brand didn't know if they could use the name. They thought Porsche owned all of the intellectual property. So as a result, these very early re-editions, the CS 3110 and these sorts of models, they don't have Carrera on the dial because we weren't sure about the IP. But, well, since last year, we've had this official relationship with them. So, of course, things are pretty easy now.
Good. And so talking about things that don't have the name on the dial, so we actually have some pre-Carreras over here. So what are these?
So to understand the Carrera's introduction in 1963, we really need to look at what Heuer was producing in the 1950s. And we can really break it down into three key references. And here on the table, we have 3336 bicompacts with black dial, a 2444, which is the 3 register version, and then curiously, what was referred to as the reference 2447. And this is a reference number that will carry over for the Carrera, but the various early watches with reference 2447, they have this very large case and these very interesting faceted lugs and this very utilitarian design language, the applied radium Arabic numerals here on both the silver and the black dials, the poly screw down case back, a design code that will carry over to the first Carreras of 63. And you can really understand the DNA and why collectors call them the pre-Carreras.
Right, and so really similar to the Rolex world of like a 6238.
Very much so, and of course, to understand the Le Mans, the first introduction of the Daytona in 1963, you have to look at 6034, 6234, these kind of references to understand how the design had evolved and got to that point. For example, Rolex were going from this 2-piece case to this 3-piece case. They changed the design of the dial from this kind of very 1940s, 1950s idea to what would very much carry over to the Daytona. And it's exactly what happened with the Carrera. The team at the time were clearly playing with these codes to make the perfect utilitarian sports watch, and that formed the foundation for the arrival of the Carrera in 63.
In 63. Not 64.
Not 64, yes. I think a few people might know the story that for the 40th anniversary it was celebrated in the wrong year because Jack simply couldn't remember what year it was introduced and it had fallen into folklore. And then, thanks to yourself and Jeff Stein, the mystery was cleared up. We found these watches dating from 1963 and we found this advertisement, I think, in a racing program for the SECA. The US market was absolutely key for Heuer and for Rolex at the time for that matter. And that's why they both launched these quintessentially sports chronograph watches in the same year, positioned at the same marketplace. And the key code here is people doing things that are high pressure, demanding environments where you need something that will hold up. Mm-hmm. And these weren't positioned at just the man on the street. Of course, many people did end up buying them, but 99.9% of the time, these were going to people who were, photojournalists in conflict zones for Leica, or someone flying for the Italian Air Force for Universal Genève. So this is exactly the same positioning for the Carrera. It was really focused on people who were living in this environment.
So let's talk a little bit about the first watches that actually read Carrera on the dial.
Yeah.
So this is reference 2447N in this case.
Reference 2447, this watch did arrive in 1963. We have a number of different sources that can confirm this information. And there's a number of clear design codes in these early watches. We see the S and the N, the big differentiating factor. The N would carry over into kind of standard production. The S would have this kind of very interesting like Grenier eggshell finish, as it's referred to by collectors. But we can see these longer hour markers, an unsigned crown, and some of them have this very interesting poly back. The other ones, we have the notch back. Recently, the consensus has been that the poly back is the earliest and correct. From what I can see, based on case number ranges, yes, the very earliest batch was probably produced like this. Mm-hmm. But I still think in 1963, as we can see with your black dial version, engraved for 1963, that there was a bit of mixing and matching of components. And yeah, with the Carrera, we can see this very clear code that is still carried over to today, which is this kind of peaked faceted lug, and of course the tension ring underneath the plexi crystal. This was an innovation that improved the water resistance of the crystal as it was fitted to the case, and Jack used it to move the 1/5 of a second scale off of the dial, similar to Rolex did with getting the tachymeter scale onto the bezel, really to open it up and to improve the legibility of it.
So talk a little bit more about what a tension ring actually is.
Yeah, so it's easier to spot on the end because it's in a contrasting color. It's this silver ring that's kind of angled. In French, it's called the rayon. Of course, we anglicize it and call it the rihor. But it's this angled position on the inside of the crystal, and it's sprung. So it fits within the plexi, and then when the plexi is fitted onto the case, it basically applies internal pressure to really fix it into position.
And the Carrera was among the first to do that?
As far as I'm aware, and someone might correct me in the comments, I think the Carrera is the only watch that has used this kind of tension ring device to increase the water resistance.
And so the 2447 is a 3-register.
Yes.
Using the value of 72.
Absolutely.
And then we move into other.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've examined the kind of very first introduced pieces. But one thing that happened very quickly, we know that there's the 2-register version, the 3647. I've bought 3 examples of that reference, all with kind of unusual dials. We have the watches that were produced for MG. All of these double name dials were actually produced in the US market. The most famous is probably the James Garner, which sold for $176,100 in 2022. And I was very pleased to secure it for the Tag Heuer Museum. It's such an important part of our history. But I'm going to name drop Jeff quite a lot in this conversation, clearly. He was the one that discovered that there was somewhere in Louisiana or something like this that was double stamping the dials for HTC, Heuer Timing Corporation in America, which was Jack's first responsibility when he joined the company in 1958. He came over to New York with his uncle and established a North American distributor. And it was one of the kind of first brands to have their own, not of a Henri Stone watch agency style, but of a Heuer kind of mass market brand to do that and take away the distributorship from the retailers and partners. So Jack had set it up. US market was absolutely key. They had a demand from MG, Sunray DX, a couple of other names to produce these double signed dials, and they found a supplier to support them with that in the US. And the curious one, I don't know if you're aware of the Arcola. For years, this was kind of one of the great enigmas of Heuer collecting, and we discovered that it's a golf club in New Jersey.
I actually did know that. I know a member at this
okay. Yeah, so there was a series of Heuers, Pre-Carreras, and 3647 stamped with the kind of Arcola logo. But yeah, so 2447 3 register, 3647 2 register. So within these early Carreras, this first series with the kind of straight batten markers, the interesting addition was the scales, and they certainly appeared early on. A good example is this Fisher with this amazing two-tone decimal scale on the edge. Fisher were a supplier to the scientific and medical industry. You could flick through the trade catalogue and buy test tubes and lab equipment, and at the end there were Heuer stopwatches and Carreras double-signed Fisher. So super rare, and this is cool because it has the poly back, so we know that it's from this very early series, and the large format case number, unsigned crown. And I just love this dial finish. Swiss only as well, so clearly 63, the story of the radium transition to the tritium. No T, so we know that it's a radium dial, but really a wonderful thing. And then the other curiosity is the pulsation scale. Super rare watch. I mean, we've maybe got a dozen known in the marketplace. Very handsome thing with this bright brushed silver dial. And then we have a red tachymeter scale, again two-tone. Again, I think this one is also Swiss only, but I love this contrasting dial color, really. And again, poly back, unsigned crown, so certainly a 63, 64 watch, something like that.
Yeah, and these style of two-tone dials, which I think a lot of people would identify with Longines and Patek and other brands that are really, in my mind, it's 1940s, 1950s, and so you can tell that these are early 1960s dials.
Absolutely, and you know what you said with Auro in Talking Watches the other day about how it was very much like familiar environment. Everyone was sharing suppliers, everyone worked together. Yeah. And of course the industry's moved in a very different direction today, but it's really a very collaborative process, and hence why we can see so many codes shared between brands.
Yeah. And then quickly we see watches with dates on them.
Yes, they were the next kind of big addition to the family. And the first series that we have is the Dato 12 with the date window at 12, both in the black dial and the silver dial. I've bought this very beautiful tropical dial, which I bought from a very friendly Swiss watch dealer last year. And you can see it has this little C number on the back, which indicate that it was sold in the Swiss market. Very pretty watch. And then alongside it, we have the silver dial version, with the wings and wheels logo of Indianapolis Motor Speedway, who we were close partners of at the time. We continue to be so to this day. But anyone exercising a little bit of logic might understand why having your date window at 12 o'clock is not such a great idea, particularly on a chronograph, because when the chrono is reset, you can't read the date. So I think only a year later, the date window moves to 9 o'clock, and we have this very interesting asymmetric kind of off-balance design. Yeah. This was the inspiration for the Hodinkee edition, so this was 2021, right? These Dato 9s, Jack's obsession was legibility. Yeah. So of course it makes perfect sense to move the date window away to 12 o'clock, but his other passion was symmetry. He loved Mies van der Rohe and Bauhaus and things that really showed balance. So to have this asymmetric design can be a little bit jarring at first, but once you get used to it, it's really a great thing. And we have both the silver dial version and the N with the white register that I really like. And then on the end, we have this little oddball. It's a triple calendar chronograph. It's called Carrera in the catalog, but in fact, this reference had been part of the Heuer catalog from the 1950s. And when the Carrera was so successful, they simply applied the Carrera name to it because it had some of the codes the same. But I think it's very difficult today to really describe this as a Carrera. I mean, it's a snapback, it doesn't have the faceted lugs, it doesn't even have the Carrera name on the dial, but it was among the most complicated watches that the brand had produced. So it's easy to understand why collectors really want to attach a Carrera name to it.
Yeah, no question. Moving on, we have more 3-register Carreras.
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic of you look at this table and you think, they all kind of look the same, but there are some some variations hiding in there somewhere. The original S and N continue, but the changes we see are with the hour markers. They get broader, they get a kind of peak, and they get this black stripe down the middle to really help to improve the legibility. The hands get a stripe down the middle as well. But the great addition at this point is this Panda and reverse Panda configuration. Right. For me, among my favorite versions of the early manual wind peaked lugged cases, just spectacularly beautiful. And continuing the purity of the early S&N, there's no scale on the dial, the registers are large and clearly visible.
Right, and this is all presumably in pursuit of legibility.
Yeah, I think, Rolex, we saw Singer had provided them with dials that were Panda and reverse Panda. I wouldn't be surprised that Jack or a retailer had come to the brand and said, look, we like this design language, can you offer something similar? So it's 5 years after the first introduction of the Carrera. We see the SN and the NS, and we also see versions with scales. So I brought along an SND, so a decimal scale, and again with this kind of two-tone finish with the Grenier on the outside and the Soleil in the center. Quite a pretty thing, but for me it's a little bit claustrophobic. And then the other weirdo oddball is the Volvo. I would still love to understand how we ended up making watches for Volvo. It wasn't the sexiest brand in the world at the time. Maybe
in the late 60s.
There were truck drivers maybe wearing these watches, I don't know. But here we have an NST with the tachymeter scale on the outside, the Volvo logo at 12 o'clock, which is crazy, and then this like tiny Heuer shield at 6 o'clock.
Amazing.
Pretty amazing to think that we sacrificed the top position for our logo to let Volvo do it. And there are other variations. There's Ortavias with the Volvo logo from the 1970s. So clearly there was some great partnership there. And then we have a 2-register version, what's colloquially called the Ford versus Ferrari. It's the watch that Matt Damon wears in the movie. So with the 3-register version of the Carrera early on, it was the same reference all the way through, 2447. With the 2-register version, Valjo had decided to move away from the column wheel chronograph, the caliber 92, and instead had gone to the 7730 series with this cam plate actuation. They were much easier and I guess more economical to produce. And the easy way to spot them is the Valjo 92 powered 3647. Obviously the hour marker designs are different, but the first thing I look at is the minute recorder, because for the Valjo 92 it's a 45-minute recorder. For the reference 7753, it's a 30-minute recorder, so quite easy to identify.
And I think on that one, Jeremy, just worth kind of double-clicking. So Matt Damon wore it as Carroll Shelby,
yes,
right?
Absolutely.
And so I think the Carrera to me has always been, along with the Daytona and a few other watches, kind of like the archetype of the driver's watch in the 60s. This is what people were actually wearing.
Absolutely.
So how did Matt Damon end up with that watch in the film?
I believe that we provided the watches for them. It was kind of before my time, but we knew that there were reference 3147 Dato Carreras with the Shelby logo on the dial with the snake. And of course, Cougar, one of the great American kind of sports car manufacturers at the time. We have Cougar signed dials as well. And to see these double signed dials, it was clearly proof that there was this indelible link between Heuer and motorsport. We skipped over the Sunray DX, but it was another motorsport team. Jack had been invited to Sebring in '62 because the SCCA needed timing equipment, and Heuer had provided it. All the teams used our stopwatches, and of course, by extension, everyone wanted our watches.
Right. And the next watch we have is actually a Carrera from kind of a different sport altogether.
Yeah, well, we have two kind of oddballs of the later 2-register chronographs. We have a watch that you very kindly donated for today, shall we say. The Skipper, the Skipperera, as everyone likes to call it. Yours is particularly nice because it's Fab Swiss, so clearly made for a French-speaking market. And yeah, we could spend a whole reference points talking about Heuer's connection to the world of the water and sailing, of course the tide indicator complications, but this is quintessentially a Carrera. It's a Carrera case. And it follows the fact that in 1967, we had been providing timing equipment once again for the Intrepid, the US entry in the America's Cup. It appears to be Abercrombie were a great partner of ours, and in fact we have an Abercrombie retailed Pre-Carrera on the table. They were opening the doors into the sporting world. One of those sports was sailing. So when the team used our timing equipment, well, actually I say it was our timing equipment, they were Aquastar regattes that were stamped with the Heuer logo because we didn't make a regatta timer, but the stopwatches were definitely from us. When they're successful in 1968, we decide to introduce this totally crazy watch. Maybe there were a couple of hundred that were made. Most of them were bought by sailors, so they all got dunked and the dials get, kind of nuked. But when you look at this color code, there's just nothing like it. Imagine this coming out in 1968.
It's really wild, and I think it's important to understand kind of the lore around the Skipper historically. There was a period there where people didn't even realize that Heuer had made this watch.
Yeah, they thought they were fake.
Right.
But it's amazing to think that through these personal relationships, through, Jack really working, day and night to build the business in the US, we end up with watches like this that is just so outside the realms of this kind of very conservative Swiss brand that's, in its 4th generation at this point. It's just a beautiful, beautiful thing.
It is. And if you look at this table of almost 60 watches, I mean, it's really the one that kind of pops off away
Absolutely.
from all the others.
Yeah, I mean, that color code, and the fact is it existed for 1 year. It was a couple of hundred watches.
Yeah.
You were extremely smart to take some codes for the first collaboration between Tag Heuer and Hodinkee. But yeah, I mean, there's just totally nothing like it. And we didn't even get to the point of doing something similar later on in the evolution of the brand under Jack. Today, of course, color is a big part of the design and the branding for many watch manufacturers. But at the time, it was totally irrational, totally illogical, but absolutely amazing.
Yeah. And then next to that, we have gold.
Yeah. So we'll speak a bit more about solid gold watches further down the line in the 1970s. But here we have, I really wanted to include them, 2 pieces. One is reference 2448, these thinner markers without the black stripe, black tacky scale. It's plaqué, it's plated. I love this black dial. It's really quite fetching. And then the other one we have is a reference 2456 from the later 1960s with the kind of revised design for the hour markers in here. I mentioned that there were S versions of the 2447 with the later series design. The interesting thing here, we have the Soleil finish to the main dial, but then the subsidiary dials, rather than being this kind of ridged silvered effect, they're stamped white. So it's a very, very different look. But this in solid gold, I mean, super, super rare thing because they were just so damn expensive in period, but really, really lovely things. So yeah, and it talks about the evolution of the watch market at the time. We start off with stainless steel utilitarian sports watches, and by the end of the 1960s, as watches start to become perceived as kind of a luxury good, a fashion object, we want to push the brand, I guess, a bit more up market, and we offer these gold pieces.
Yeah, and so of course, in the late 1960s, for readers at home or watchers at home, obviously Quartz comes into the picture.
Yeah.
We start to see real material innovation from a mechanical perspective, which leads us right into the next watch here.
Absolutely. So 1969, the introduction of the Caliber 11, the first commercially available automatic chronograph, let's say. We know that Seiko and Zenit also produced watches in 1969 with automatic chronograph movements, but Heuer was really the first to kind of ship them at a mass scale. We know that in March, when we did this incredible, global launch, we did simultaneous product presentations in New York and in Switzerland. Today, of course, it's common, but at the time it was completely revolutionary. And the movement inside is fascinating. To develop a movement like this, it was just massive, massive technical investment. And Jack said that they knew that automatics were going to be dominant. So in 1966, they formed this kind of team to launch the product. And it starts with a Buren micro rotor movement. Buren would be acquired by Hamilton before the product launched, so that's how Hamilton ended up with the movement. We have Dupois-Duprat, this famous module producer, making the chronograph component on top. Breitling and Heuer were bankrolling the whole project because they were the ones that really needed it. And again, it ties back into this thing that it was one big family. Willy Breitling and Jack Heuer sat together and decided they were going to spend their money on developing an automatic chronograph together. And the one you have in your hand is particularly rare, the so-called Chronomatic. Jack and Willy had decided on this trade name to support the launch of the automatic chronograph, the Caliber 11. And when they put it out to the market and Jack was kind of doing sampling, he said chronomatic, chronomatic, chronomatic. No one knew what the hell he was talking about, so he said, we'll just put automatic chronograph on the dial. And Willy had come to Jack and said, look, you have so many great names, Ottavia Carrera, you have the Monaco that's going to launch with this. We don't have anything. Can we have the chronomatic name? And Jack was like, yeah, sure, no one knows what it means anyway, so knock yourself out. But it really changed the design and configuration of the dial because we have chronomatic above the Heuer logo and then Carrera at the bottom. Optically, you don't necessarily notice it at first, but once you see the model name at 6 o'clock, it's really a different animal.
And these are among kind of the most sought after of Carreras.
Yeah, pretty much. Of the automatic versions, particularly in steel, the Chronomatic is the most valuable, certainly. I can't think of anything that would eclipse it. I mean, for the gold watches, it's a little bit different. But yeah, I mean, they're very coveted fundamentally because of their rarity. I mean, the design-wise, they're not that different from the other 2 pieces that we have. We have a so-called Mick Jagger with the 3, 6, 9, 12 positions for the hour recorder. And then next to it, we have the version that's 1 through 12. So very, very small variations. There was a slight change in the hour marker design for these watches, but these iterations will happen very quickly. You said that Quartz arrived around this time, 1969, exactly the same time as the Chronomatic debuts. Seiko relaunched the Astron. And at the time, the Swiss watch industry were like, who's going to care about this? Mechanical forever.
Yeah.
But we know that things changed. And during this period, they were really playing around with the design.
And what is this?
This is a caliber 15. So off the back of the challenging economic environment of the 1970s, the Nixon shock, stagflation, a recession, the arrival of Quartz, Heuer needed a cheaper version of, the Caliber 11 would become the Caliber 12 with some improvements. The cheaper version, which removed the hour recorder and replaced it with running seconds at 10 o'clock, was called the Caliber 15. We had a couple of these movements as well to kind of improve the economics and margins of the models. And then, this late design with this completely different aesthetic, this grey dial, it's quite unusual. And then we can see next to it, we have this kind of regatta timer sort of thing with the orange accents, and then this really funky one, which is this blue with these oval subdials, and it's quite cool because it's like Côte de Genève engraving on the dial and kind of super iridescent.
And then quickly we move into what is, I would say, a favorite of both yours and mine, the
Absolutely.
1158.
Exactly. We have this quirky one on the table, which is branded as a chronomatic. My gut feeling is that probably it was a prototype dial that was produced by the brand and has eventually found its way into a very, very small number of watches. We've seen 4 or 5 of them. They were never retailed in this configuration because by late 1969, they'd already moved away from the chronomatic name. So for me, that's a sample dial, but we also have the standard S, which is being kindly provided by a North American collector. And this one's cool because it's got the French hallmarks, so the French importation gold marks. So quite a quirky thing. And then the champagne dial. So the S and the CH, as we call it, they're very fetching watches. They're very handsome. The solid gold makes them super, super nice to wear. But the magic really is the CHN. And of course, this is the watch that would become synonymous with the Ferrari drivers.
So explain that a little bit.
Sure. So 1971, Jack hears from a manager at Heuer that he was at a restaurant in Saint-Imier and he saw Clay Regazzone meeting with someone from Longines. Jack says, that's weird. Why is this great Ferrari Formula One driver meeting with someone who's Longines? Jack looks around. It turns out the technical director for the Ferrari Formula One team at the time is a Swiss guy and was in the same ski club as Jack. So Jack's like, okay, I'll just reach out to him. And the guy's like, yeah, we need professional timing equipment. We have a new driver lineup and we're developing this brand new car, the 312. And to benchmark the performance, we need timing equipment. So Francois, he's an Italian speaker. He goes down to Maranello, meets with the team, understands their needs. They need it for endurance racing. They need it for Formula One. And Jack's like, fantastic. You know, the company's finances were a little bit tricky. It was highly leveraged because it was going through a massive expansion at the time. It's like, yeah, Ferrari are going to pay us, 50,000 francs for timing equipment. So Jack drives down to Maranello to meet with Enzo, and then they go through to Enzo's office, and famously his office was very lowly lit. He had this picture of his son Dino, who'd sadly passed away from muscular dystrophy a few years before, and it's kind of this shrine. And Enzo says, nope, that's not the deal. The drivers are getting too expensive. You're going to pay each of them 25,000 francs. You're going to give us the timing equipment for free. You're going to get a sticker on the car and you'll get a patch on the overalls. And Jack says, okay, but we'll also give them this gold watch as a kind of commemoration of the relationship, and the guys will come to the factory to collect it. So we have these amazing pictures of Clay Regazzone and Niki Lauda with Jack looking at the watches and stuff. So it wasn't about putting a logo on a car and getting some exposure. It was fundamentally a technical partnership. And with the ability to benchmark the driver and car performance at Feuerano using the Le Mans Centigraph, in 1975, Niki Lauda wins the championship again. And it's a great commemorative moment. We produced the Monza in 76 to commemorate the occasion. It's an 1158 case, but in brass that's then got this black chrome oxide coating to it. But yeah, I mean, this watch is absolutely fundamentally the encapsulation of Heuer's indelible relationship with motorsport.
Right, and explain a little bit about, there's this lore of these coming with drivers' initials and their blood type on the back.
The blood type thing is apocryphal. We've had a number show up that were belonging to both the Ferrari works drivers. So Arturo Mezzario, the cowboy of the pit lane, as they called him, who wore this cowboy hat. He was an endurance racer fundamentally, but did some Formula One racing with Ferrari. His one showed up and it says in Italian, thanks for a wonderful collaboration, Jack W. Heuer. Ronnie Peterson showed up. Ronnie was not a Ferrari driver, but Jack built a very, very close relationship with him. And on the back, it says success, Jack W. Heuer.
Yeah.
We have a few different engravings like that. Mike Hailwood's one showed up. Again, he wasn't a Ferrari driver, but Jack had become quite close to Mike. He was racing for Porsche at Le Mans in the 917.
Yep.
And Jack had witnessed him saving the life of Clay at the South African Grand Prix. Mike had stopped his car in the middle of the race and pulled him from the burning wreckage, and Jack gave the watch to kind of recognize this great act of bravery. But yeah, so we have these dedications, we have these messages, but drivers would have had to have been crazy to wear watches in the cockpit at the time, because when these guys had accidents, there was huge risk, particularly a watch on a bracelet would, very badly injure them. And there was one driver, I think he crashed at Spa and had to have a lot of surgery to fix it.
And I think that this watch in particular, it reminds me of a story I wrote a very long time ago about the Monaco. So I mean, I think there's this kind of like revisionist history of what the Monaco meant to race car drivers. And obviously featured in Le Mans was Steve McQueen.
Sure.
But this was really the watch designed for racing. And the Monaco is really almost like a design object.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is for me, the Monaco, everyone likes to talk about its connection to motorsport, but there isn't really one. The Carrera is our motorsport watch.
Yeah.
And the Monaco we launched in '69 with the arrival of the automatic chronograph, because we had the Otavi, we had the Carrera that went to this kind of C-shaped Genta Amiga Constellation style case, but we needed something profoundly impactful and revolutionary. And it was this square waterproof case from Pre-Carrera, famous for the super compressors. They patented it, and Jack saw this case design and was like, wow, this, I always say, it must have looked like an alien spaceship had arrived in 1969. It looked like nothing else. And the fact is, we couldn't even sell the damn things. So they have piles of them, and of course they needed one for Steve, one for the stunt double, one for the close-ups, half a dozen watches. And that's why Steve ends up wearing this Monaco. And Jack's like, great, it's gonna save the watch. And of course, at the end of it all, Steve says, you can't use my image for advertising, and that's that. And the Monaco, it doesn't work. 1974, the watch is discontinued and replaced by the Silverstone. And that's the lifespan of the Monaco. No drivers wore it. Stanley Kubrick wore one. Sammy Davis Jr. wore one.
Sure.
So we know that great creative minds understood the importance of the Monaco as an object, but it was not a motor racing watch. I mean, imagine wearing this huge brick of metal on your wrist in the cockpit. It would have got completely destroyed.
Yeah.
So yeah, for me, it's the 1158 and the Carrera family at large, which are our connection to motorsport.
And then we kind of go into kind of a hybrid here, which looks a lot like the automatic watch, but is not.
Yeah, so two kind of oddities continuing the gold story. We have the gold-plated version here with the logo of the country of Bahrain. Looks like an 1158, case is exactly the same as the 1158, but it's steel and it's engraved with Heuer official timekeepers at the Olympics 1980. So, this is kind of like a weird oddity produced just as the company's kind of spiraling the plug hole, as it were. And then here we have a kind of segue into the manual wind watches. Now, of course, everyone thinks of the 1153 and 1158 as automatic watches, which absolutely they were, but as we already described with the Caliber 15, Heuer needed a more economic model to offer in the marketplace. So they went back to Valjoux and ended up with the 77 series of movement. So here we have a gold-plated version with the pulsation scale on the edge of the dial, which is kind of funky. Then we have the two-register version with date. Same caliber, the 7740 that was used in the black Monaco 74033N, and then another kind of blue dial 3-register chrono as well. So I mean the obvious giveaway is the crown is at the standard position rather than at 3 o'clock, which was a technical limitation of the automatic chronograph movement. But we turned this advertising message saying, oh, now it's automatic, you don't need to wind it. So we have these 3 weird manual things.
So then we move into what you would call a barrel case, I guess?
Exactly, yeah. The barrel cases arrived sometime around 75, 76. And they arrive as both a Caliber 12 equipped watch with the 2 registers and the Caliber 15 with the running seconds at 10 o'clock. And you can see this kind of, number one is the design. It's just the craziest looking thing with this really unusual looking case.
Yeah.
One thing that most people don't identify is this like oval shaped, polished bevel around the crystal, and it's mineral by this point rather than plexi. And then we have this, sunburst finish to the case finishing, and these really like unusual proportions. It's kind of short and squat. And then this Côte de Genève finish, and we have it in the fumé with this dégradé finish to it and some kind of funky orange accent. We have the blue, and this one's an odd one because it's for the Angolan Liberation Army, I think it was called, with a Kalashnikov AK-47 engraved on the back.
What else?
Yeah, we were selling to every regime that you can imagine at this point. And then we have this kind of powder coat. It's kind of a thicker finish, but it's certainly not PVD at this stage. Quite a weird looking thing if you think, okay, we have Porsche design in 72 and we have the Enicar, but it was the Black Monaco, the Monza, and watches like this, where Heuer had really started to play with this kind of finish and idea.
That's cool.
And then the other end of the spectrum, gold plate with this, again, Côte de Genève dial and these oval subdials. And then on the end, we have the 2 Caliber 15s, the Fumé and the blue. And
again, this would be kind of like mid to late 70s.
Yeah, this is very much, towards the end of the 1970s. And it's really Jack and Heuer, they were probably committed to a set number of movements from Buren and Dupois de Pras, and they were struggling to sell them. With the arrival of the 6139 from Seiko, much more economic and accessible chronograph, and the scaling of Quartz at this point, the automatic chronograph, it was just too expensive for the marketplace. So you can see it, the Pasadena, the Jarama, the Daytona, the Monza, the Silverstone, the Monaco, the Carrera, the Ottavia. We had so many different model lines that we were just in full-on experimentation mode for sort of the 10 years after the introduction.
And then finally we have...
Yeah, now we end up in the really kind of oddball section of things. People forget that there were these Carreras. So we have 2 Quartz models. The 3-hander, the first time-only Carrera. This probably arrived around 1978. Quite cool because it retains the kind of silhouette of the 1153.
Yeah, looks nice.
But with this kind of ultra-thin case to it. So, really quite an elegant thing, but they were just profoundly unreliable and, very expensive versus the kind of mass-produced Quartz watches from Asia. And then this amazing gold-plated Quartz chronograph watch. Carrera name on the dial, but it's really hard to envisage this in the kind of Carrera universe. So that was 78, 79. Heuer had a fantastic amount of expertise in Quartz watches, from the timing equipment. They had miniaturized it into the chrono split that was also worn by the Ferrari drivers. There were Cavallino stamped versions of that watch, and they continued to fit it into the other product lines. And then right at the tail end of things, so 82, Jack loses control of the business. Piaget take over for 3 years until they sell it to TAG. But during this kind of intermediary period under Piaget's ownership, Piaget also had a massive stake in La Magna. So these are La Magna 5100 powered. They say Carrera. I mean, the 2 steel ones, the standard steel and the black coat, they say Carrera on the dial, but they have no real kind of codes connecting them to the Carrera. But the La Magna 5100, it's a fascinating movement. So I think it's a great part of the story. And then lastly, we have, the super oddball. So it's an 1158 case, but with a crown at 3 o'clock and a La Magna 5100 movement inside.
And it's solid gold.
Solid gold, yeah. I mean, how on earth this watch came about or how it existed, still a bit of an enigma. But yeah, quite an incredible thing.
But I mean, this is kind of indicative of what the entire watch industry was in the early 80s. I mean, it was just kind of everybody kind of doing all they could to survive, frankly.
Absolutely, and everyone talks about the watch industry got into all this trouble in the 70s because of the Quartz crisis. Okay, yeah, that was a bit of it, that there were much cheaper watches in the marketplace. But the other fact as well was this economic situation in the US. As Richard Nixon suspends the Bretton Woods Act, is it? Where the US currency becomes free floating against other markets. There was massive volatility between the Swiss franc and the US dollar. And it meant that the companies simply weren't profitable with their US setup. So that's 2 of them. And then the last part is how fundamentally disorganized the Swiss watchmaking industry was at the time. It was run exactly the same way it had been run 150 years before at the beginning of the 19th century, with all of these tiny little fournisseurs and suppliers. And they were basically going bankrupt and disappearing overnight. And all of a sudden your whole supply chain was disrupted. Whereas the Japanese, full end-to-end verticalized production. Of course, that's what the watch industry is today, but it took them 30 years to get to that point. So it was so chaotic. Everyone was scrambling, trying to fit some parts together to shift some units, that we end up with these, seriously funky oddball watches.
Yeah, and so where is the market for vintage Carreras today?
Everyone who's been following the vintage Heuer market will know that there was this kind of crazy spike in 2016, 2017, particularly with some auction results. Huge sums of money being traded hands for fairly common watches. We know that there's been a cooling off in that space, but as we've seen, condition stands for everything. And when we see something like, Hodinkee Vintage Shop sold an eggshell 2447 for $16,000 or $18,000 US. The Panda and reverse Pandas are, $30,000, $40,000 watches. 1158 CHNs, good one is 30K, on the bracelet is maybe 50K with provenance. These things are performing spectacularly well. The Skipperera, of course, as you know, it's, cracking on for being a 6-figure watch. Of course, it's great to talk about the high end and what makes the Carrera super collectible, but at the same time, people can still walk in with $3,000, $4,000 in their pocket and buy a great 1153 or 1553. So even the early 2447 S&N, not a polyback Swiss only, but maybe something more standard. Maybe it's $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. That's the beautiful thing about Heuer. You can come in at any price point that you want, from the low 4 figures all the way up to 6 figures. and find something that you can really, really enjoy. So I think we've seen a great consolidation in the pricing of the market. And yeah, okay, it's not the crazy prices that we saw, but it's a much, much more healthy place.
Yeah.
So Ben, now that I've spoken almost solidly for 45 minutes or what it feels like, I think it's time for you to do a bit more talking.
Sure.
I mean, we have nearly 60 watches for 60 years of Carrera on the table. Is there anything that's really standing out for you?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are a few watches on this table that belong to me. So
sure.
I mean, those
putting
aside,
those aside.
Yeah, putting those aside. I think for me, and my interest in most important watches tends to gravitate towards the early examples. Sure. And so I've written extensively about the double Swiss 6239, Daytonas, et cetera. And the equivalent of that in the Carrera world are these early eggshelly kind of white, off-white dials. And to me, this is a watch I've always wanted to own and never have. I mean, this is something that really kind of resonates with me. The silver dials, which again, akin to the Daytona, like they're beautiful, they're wonderful, but I much prefer this kind of muted, kind of vintagey, vintage look of the really early ones.
Yeah.
Anything that has motorsport, direct motorsport provenance, something with an MG on a dial. I'm not an MG guy, but if that's something else, that would be kind of a holy grail watch.
Yeah.
Obviously Skipper, obviously gold. I think for me, chronomatic is something I've always wanted to kind of dabble in and
Sure.
never just had the opportunity to. But like you, the two-tone dials are really compelling because they really feel special. They feel different than all the other chronographs of the period. The early manually wound stuff is super compelling. The gold stuff for sure. I mean, as you've said very eloquently, like this is the purest connection to motorsport of any watch that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
The Carrera in many ways is kind of the most iconic sports watch that people don't talk about as much as they should.
Yeah, I think you really hit on a note there that I often say to collectors, for me, in the contemporary modern era of watch collecting, we've kind of had three phases. Throughout the 1990s, we had what I call the scholarly collector. It was your granddad with his painted pocket watches, sitting there smoking his pipe with his magnifying glass in the evening, looking at them. And then in the 2000s, we have what I like to call the intellectual collector, the guys obsessed with in-house and independence and, black polishing and these kind of things. But for me, it's the modern era that's most interesting, which for me is this anthropological collector, that we have these young collectors in their 20s, from all over the world, Asia, North America, Europe, the Middle East, Australia, wherever it might be, who are amazed by the story of these pieces. But when it comes to vintage, what that means is they want to know who wore this thing.
Right.
And when we look at a gold Carrera, for example, how many great pictures do we have of Mario Andretti, Mauro Fighieri, Niki Lauda, Clay Regazzone, every great driver of the 1970s was wearing these watches. And of course, I spoke about the Garner earlier, but we have so many iconic individuals from this era.
Yeah.
James Hunt, great, charismatic, huge character who wore a reverse Panda. We have this great picture of him in this advert for like Vauxhall or something in the late 1960s or early 1970s. Yeah. And you can see the watch, and it's this connection to the human being, and that these guys were choosing to wear an 1158, a 2447 as their like singular piece of jewelry, the thing that was most personal to them, that sat against their skin the whole time. This for me is what is so emblematic and strong about what makes the Carrera special, that it's this totem, this emotional object.
So we spent today looking at Carreras of yesteryear, and I think there's been a lot of development with Carrera over the past few years under the current administration, we'll say, and limited editions with us and with others. Is there a connection between all of these watches from the past 60 years and what lay ahead?
Yeah, so 2023, obviously the 60th anniversary, obviously we need to reimagine what the Carrera looks like in the modern age. We've had a couple of hits in recent years, particularly this 39mm glass box format that you so successfully used for the Skipper era and the Dato. We had the Fragment as well. We've had the green and the red in recent years. And as kind of the appetizer to the main course that is the Carrera reimagined in 2023, we have something quite special that has made its debut at LVMH Watch Week in January, and that is a watch that I have hiding in my pocket, actually, conveniently. So it's an homage, let's say, to what for me is probably the most handsome of the reference 2447 Carreras. We'd already paid respects and dues to the Carrera for the 160th anniversary of the company in 2020 with the silver dial version. So instead, what we decided to look at was the most collectible version of these watches, which is the Panda. And it really plays into Jack's idea of legibility. We have this high contrast dial with the black subdials and the sunburst finished silver dial. But really, this is a bookmark to the end of the Carrera in its current form. and for us to look forward to the future to a reimagining of the Carrera for this day and age, which will make its debut at Watches and Wonders.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of collecting and the community and the stability of a market, I think that there's really a long way to go. And I think that's what's kind of most exciting and why I was so excited to sit down here with you to go over all of these almost 60 watches over the past 60 years.
Yeah, and I mean, I really hope that Reference Points, it's such an iconic series, it's such a great property for you guys, and to be able to have all of these watches before us, to see them like this, I think it's going to be one of the most valuable resources for the Carrera during its 60th anniversary. So really a great honor to do it with such a close friend. So thank you, Ben.
My pleasure.